My fingertips dug so deeply into the polished oak pew that my knuckles turned alabaster white. We were gathered in the grand cathedral where my father had been a respected deacon for over 40 years, surrounded by faces of people who believed they understood the man he was. Friends, colleagues, extended family, all with their own versions of Patrick Sullivan, the community pillar, the generous philanthropist, the devoted father. Then my sister Rebecca approached the podium, her designer. Heels clicking against marble, the sound echoing through the vaulted ceiling. She adjusted her pearl necklace, smoothed her immaculate black dress, and gazed out at the congregation with that self-assured smile she'd perfected since childhood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You would have thought she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life, the way she commanded attention, like this was her spotlight to claim rather than a farewell to our father. I want to share something special, Rebecca began, her voice unwavering, resonating through the church's perfect acoustics. Dad entrusted me with his most cherished memories and final wishes. He told me, just before he passed, that I was his greatest achievement. The words hung suspended in the air, like dust motes caught in the colored light filtering through stained glass. She paused, letting her words sink into the collective consciousness of the mourners. He said he was at peace knowing I would carry on his legacy the way he always envisioned. Soft murmurs of approval rippled through the pews. Several people nodded solemnly. My Uncle Marcus even reached across to squeeze her hand in solidarity. But something inside me shattered, something I'd spent years carefully piecing back together. Was it a lie? Perhaps not entirely. Dad had always placed Rebecca on a pedestal, making it clear where his pride lay. But those final days told a different story, one Rebecca hadn't been present to witness. I hadn't planned to speak today. Public attention was Rebecca's domain, not mine. I'd spent most of my life creating space for her achievements, her narratives, her version of our shared history. So I remained silent, clutching the pew, until I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. It was Noah, my 13-year-old son, his serious eyes holding a wisdom beyond his years. He didn't speak immediately, just carefully withdrew something from his suit jacket. My heart nearly stopped when I saw what he held. A small silver flash drive. The one containing footage we'd discovered in Dad's study last week. The one whose contents I'd kept to myself, uncertain what to do with the truth it contained. Noah turned to face me, his young face framed by the cathedral's soaring arches behind him. He lifted the flash drive slightly and whispered, "Should I show them what Grandpa really said 2 days before he died?" The congregation seemed to freeze mid-breath. Rebecca halted her practiced eulogy. Someone gasped softly from the family section. Every single person turned toward us, toward me, their expressions ranging from confusion to curiosity to concern. It felt like being plunged into ice water. The air disappeared from my lungs. I wanted to take the drive from Noah's hand. To protect him. From what? From the aftermath of truth? From Rebecca's inevitable wrath? From the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the stories families tell themselves aren't the whole picture. I met my son's gaze, searching for any hint of malice or revenge in his expression, but found only calm certainty. He wasn't doing this to create drama or embarrass his aunt. He was doing this because, to him, truth was a simple thing. Either you spoke it or you didn't. And in that crystalline moment, something fundamental shifted within me. This wasn't about proving Rebecca wrong or positioning myself as the better daughter. This was about honoring the man my father had become at the end, a man who had found the courage to speak honestly after decades of silence. Because sometimes the most healing gift we can offer is to let someone's final truth be heard, especially when that truth has the power to mend what's broken. I nodded once, and Noah stood. flash drive clutched in his hand like a tiny beacon of light. I hadn't returned to Westmore in nearly a decade. Driving through the iron gates of our childhood community, I was struck by how the sprawling Victorian homes still stood proudly behind their manicured gardens, barely changed from my youth. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and hydrangea blossoms, yet nothing about it felt like coming home. This place ceased being my sanctuary the day my mother abandoned us 20 years ago, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note and decades of unanswered questions. I returned because my father was gone now, too. Patrick Sullivan, philanthropist, community leader, and a man whose approval I'd spent my entire life chasing without success. The cathedral loomed just beyond the neighborhood park, its Gothic spires stretching toward heaven like fingers seeking absolution. That massive stone building contained countless memories: my confirmation, my hasty wedding, my mother's memorial service when she was finally declared legally deceased 7 years after her disappearance. Its walls had absorbed so many Sullivan family secrets. The family estate felt like a museum of carefully curated memories. Every room still echoed with the past. The grandfather clock in the foyer that chimed just slightly off-key. The creak of the third stair that we'd learned to skip as children sneaking downstairs. The faint smell of Dad's pipe tobacco that had seeped permanently into the wallpaper. It was where I'd spent the last 3 months caring for him as cancer methodically dismantled his once imposing frame, while the world outside continued its relentless forward motion. When Dad received his diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer with metastasis to the liver, Rebecca sent extravagant flower arrangements weekly. She coordinated with specialists from her home in London, arranged for the best hospice care money could buy, and called every Sunday precisely at 8 p.m. But she never came home. There was always some critical reason: an international conference where she was keynoting, a crucial board meeting for her foundation, a diplomatic function she couldn't possibly miss. She'd constructed a life of significance on paper: humanitarian, awards, TED Talks, a marriage to a British diplomat, twin daughters attending elite boarding schools. And in Dad's estimation, that life represented the Sullivan legacy perfectly. But it was me who administered his medications when the pain became unbearable. It was me who held cool cloths to his forehead during feverish nights. It was me who listened as his carefully constructed facade began to crack in those final weeks, revealing glimpses of regret and recognition. It was me who was there when he whispered, "Ella, I need to record something. Will you help me?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I found his old digital video camera in his study, buried beneath financial portfolios and community award plaques. He held it with trembling hands, like it was both precious and terrifying. When I asked if he wanted me to call Rebecca so she could hear whatever message he wanted to leave, he shook his head firmly. "This needs to be said clearly, just once," he whispered. He recorded for nearly 20 minutes, stopping occasionally to gather strength or collect his thoughts. When he finished, he handed me the camera and said simply, "Keep this safe. The truth matters, Ella." He slipped into a morphine-induced sleep afterward and passed away 2 days later, never regaining full consciousness. I didn't watch the recording immediately. I couldn't. I was drowning in funeral arrangements, in grief, in the sudden whirlwind of Rebecca's return and her immediate assumption of control over every decision. Part of me feared what Dad might have said, perhaps final instructions I wouldn't be able to fulfill, or worse, more praise for Rebecca's accomplishments while I remained an afterthought. So I transferred the file to a flash drive and tucked it away, not yet ready to face whatever truths or disappointments it might contain. Let me tell you more about who we were before that moment in the cathedral changed everything. I'm Ella Sullivan Reeves, 41, single parent, widowed 3 years ago when my husband Michael's heart simply stopped one ordinary Tuesday morning. I work as a restoration architect for historical buildings, which allows me flexible hours to be there for Noah and pays just enough to maintain our modest home on the outskirts of the city. Noah is my miracle, my compass, my reason. 13 now, with an old soul wrapped in adolescent awkwardness, thoughtful in ways that sometimes startle me, observant of nuances most adults miss. He asks questions that cut through pretense. Why do grown-ups say they're fine when their eyes look sad? Or is keeping a secret the same as telling a lie? The only person who seemed to truly understand him was my father, which surprised everyone, including me. Patrick Sullivan had always been emotionally distant, rigid in his expectations, quick to criticize and slow to praise. He built his construction company from nothing into the largest development firm in 3 counties, served on every important community board, donated generously to causes that enhanced his standing. He operated by a clear code. Success was measurable, emotions were messy, and family reputation was everything. Rebecca thrived under these expectations. She was valedictorian, student body president, scholarship recipient to Princeton, and eventually, founder of an international education nonprofit that put her photograph beside world leaders. I was the disappointment, creative rather than practical, emotional rather than strategic, the one who chose a hobby career restoring old buildings instead of creating new empires. Dad's assessment was consistent throughout my childhood. Your sister understands what matters. She builds legacies. You focus too much on saving what's already broken. But during those final months, as cancer stripped away his carefully constructed armor, I glimpsed a different man emerging. One evening, as I adjusted his pillows, he caught my wrist suddenly. "You build too, Ella," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. Different things, but still important. I didn't know how to respond. After decades of measuring myself against impossible standards and coming up short, this small acknowledgement felt monumental, yet also terrifying in its unfamiliarity. The cathedral filled rapidly with mourners the morning of the funeral. I sat in the front pew with Noah, his hand warm and steady in mine, while the quiet hum of conversation rose behind us. Every few minutes, someone would approach to offer condolences. Dad's business associates, neighbors, charity board members, their expressions a careful blend of sympathy and assessment. I could feel their unspoken questions. What would happen? To the Sullivan construction empire now? Would Rebecca relocate back to America to take over? Would the philanthropic foundation continue its work? No one asked about my well-being or Noah's. We were peripheral characters in the Patrick Sullivan story. Rebecca arrived precisely 15 minutes before the service began, making an entrance that drew every eye. Her husband James walked 2 steps behind her, their twin daughters following in perfect synchronization, like a royal family granting an audience. She wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her grief elegant and camera-ready. She nodded briefly in my direction but didn't approach immediately. Instead, she spoke with the minister, apparently making last-minute adjustments to the service program. When she finally slid into the pew beside me, she whispered, "I've added a few personal remarks to the minister's eulogy, and I'll be speaking, of course. I assume that's fine." It wasn't a question. It never was with Rebecca. I nodded mutely, feeling that familiar invisibility descend. Noah squeezed my hand, his eyes watching Rebecca with that thoughtful, slightly puzzled expression he often wore when observing adult behavior he couldn't quite understand. Dad's mahogany casket dominated. The front of the cathedral, draped with an arrangement of white lilies and evergreen boughs. Rebecca's selection, not mine. I would have chosen the wildflowers that grew along the creek where Dad had taught us to fish as children before success consumed his attention. But that memory wasn't part of the official Sullivan narrative, so it remained unacknowledged, like so many other truths. The service proceeded like a well-orchestrated performance. Hymns chosen for their dignified restraint rather than emotional resonance. Scripture readings that emphasized legacy and honor rather than love or forgiveness. Business associates offering carefully composed remembrances of Patrick Sullivan's professional accomplishments and community contributions. It was a memorial befitting the man everyone thought they knew, the public figure, not the father who had finally, in his last days, begun to reveal his deeper truths. Then Rebecca approached the podium, her posture perfect, her composure unshakable. She surveyed the congregation with practiced poise, allowing a moment of silence to build anticipation. "My father," she began, her voice clear and controlled, "was an extraordinary man who built extraordinary things. Buildings that shape skylines, businesses that employ hundreds, community initiatives that will benefit generations to come." She paused. The silence waited with appreciation. "But his greatest gift to me, to us, was his wisdom." Another pause, this one accompanied by a slight softening of her expression. "During our last conversation just days before he left, Dad shared something I'll cherish forever. He told me he considered me his greatest legacy, that seeing me carry forward his values of excellence, leadership, and philanthropy gave him peace in his final moments." The cathedral seemed to hold its collective breath. I felt my chest constrict, my lungs refusing to function properly. This wasn't merely an embellishment or a daughter's wishful thinking. This was a complete reimagining of what had actually occurred during those final days. Rebecca hadn't been there. She hadn't witnessed his painful reckonings, his whispered regrets, his request for the camera. She hadn't held his hand through the night when pain medication wasn't enough. She hadn't heard his actual last words. He entrusted me with continuing his most important work, Rebecca continued, her voice catching slightly, a perfectly timed display of emotion. Both his business interests and his philanthropic vision. It's a responsibility I accept with humility and determination. Around me, people nodded approvingly. An elderly board member from the hospital foundation dabbed at her eyes. The mayor, seated near the front, looked suitably impressed. The story Rebecca was crafting wasn't just about claiming Dad's approval. It was about positioning herself as his natural successor, the rightful inheritor of everything he'd built. And no one questioned it because it aligned so perfectly with the narrative they'd always accepted about the Sullivan daughters, Rebecca the achiever, Ella the also-ran. I felt Noah shift beside me. He'd been uncommonly quiet throughout the service, observing everything with those perceptive eyes. Now, he leaned close and whispered, "Aunt Rebecca wasn't there, was she? When Grandpa talked about his regrets?" I shook my head slightly, unwilling to speak the truth aloud in this sacred space but unable to lie to my son. He considered this for a moment, then asked, "Have you watched the video yet? The one Grandpa made?" The question pierced me. I had watched it finally, the night before the funeral. Alone in Dad's study, I'd plugged the flash drive into his computer and witnessed his final, unfiltered thoughts. What he'd said had left me simultaneously vindicated and heartbroken, feelings I wasn't prepared to navigate while orchestrating his funeral. "Yes," I whispered back to Noah. "I have." "People should know what he really said," Noah responded, his adolescent sense of justice flaring. "It's not right to let them believe something that isn't true." I hesitated, torn between my lifelong habit of avoiding conflict and my growing awareness that some silences cause more damage than truth ever could. "It's complicated, Noah," I began. But he was already reaching into his pocket, extracting the flash drive I'd left on my bedside table that morning. "Is it?" he asked simply. "Grandpa wanted people to hear him. That's why he made the video, right?" Rebecca concluded her remarks to appreciative murmurs and returned to her seat, accepting James's supportive arm around her shoulders. The minister stepped forward, preparing to lead the congregation in a final prayer before the procession to the cemetery. It was almost over. We could leave this cathedral, bury our father, and return to our separate lives with the official narrative intact. The easier path stretched clearly before me. But Noah was watching me intently, the flash drive cupped in his palm like a small silver truth waiting to be acknowledged. "Mom," he whispered urgently. "Should I?" I looked at my son, this remarkable boy who somehow understood that honesty, even when difficult, was ultimately less painful than perpetuating comfortable illusions. I thought about my father's final request. "The truth matters, Ella." I thought about all the years I'd spent accepting Rebecca's version of our shared reality, about how that acceptance had slowly eroded my own sense of worth. Slowly, I nodded. Noah stood before I could reconsider. "Excuse me," he said, his voice surprisingly steady for a 13-year-old addressing a cathedral full of mourners. "Before we finish, there's something my grandfather wanted everyone to hear." Rebecca straightened in her seat, confusion and alarm flashing across her face. "Ella," she hissed, "what is he doing?" But Noah was already walking toward the minister, flash drive extended. "My grandfather recorded a message before he died," he explained. "I think he'd want it played today." The minister looked uncertainly between Noah and Rebecca, clearly sensing the tension but uncertain of protocol. Rebecca rose halfway, prepared to intervene, but something in my expression stopped her. Perhaps it was determination she'd never seen before, or perhaps it was simply the unexpected realization that for once I wasn't backing down. "I believe," I said, my voice carrying more clearly than I expected, "that my father's own words would be an appropriate conclusion to this service." I walked forward to join Noah, placing my hand on his shoulder both in support and to steady myself. The minister hesitated briefly, then nodded, gesturing toward the audio-visual technician who had been managing the service's music and presentations. As the technician connected the flash drive to the cathedral's system, Rebecca approached us, her smile fixed, but her eyes blazing. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she whispered fiercely. "This is completely inappropriate." I met her gaze directly. "It's Dad's funeral, Rebecca. These are his words. I think that's precisely what's appropriate." Before she could respond, the large screens on either side of the altar illuminated with my father's face. Gaunt, unshaven, but with eyes more clear and present than they had been in weeks. The cathedral fell silent as his voice, frail but determined, filled the vast space. "If someone's watching this, then I've passed on," he began. "And there are things I need to say while I still can. Things I should have said years ago." I hadn't been back to Westmore in almost 10 years. Driving past the ornate iron gates with their entwined W design felt like crossing a threshold not just into an exclusive neighborhood, but into a past I'd carefully walled away. The pristine streets with their canopy of century-old oaks seemed narrower than I remembered, the grand homes behind their perfect hedges smaller somehow. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, yet nothing felt the same. Spring had transformed the landscape into a masterpiece of flowering dogwoods and carefully orchestrated tulip beds. The air carried the sweet perfume of magnolias and freshly mowed lawns, but underlying it all was the faint mustiness of old money and older secrets. This place had stopped being home long before I physically left it. It ceased being my anchor. The moment my mother disappeared without explanation, leaving 3 half-empty coffee cups on the breakfast table, and questions that would never find answers. I returned because Patrick Sullivan, community pillar, business magnate my father, had finally lost his battle with pancreatic cancer. The disease had accomplished what nothing else could. It had humbled the unhumbleable man, stripped away his carefully constructed facade of invincibility, and in those final weeks, cracked open something long calcified within him. The Sullivan estate stood at the end of Ambassador Lane, its Georgian columns and sweeping portico a testament to old Southern architecture and newer money. As I pulled into the circular driveway, Memories assaulted me from every angle. The side garden where I'd hidden during endless charity events. The balcony where Rebecca had announced her Princeton scholarship. The stone bench where Dad sat every Sunday after church, reading financial papers while the rest of the neighborhood enjoyed family barbecues. This house still whispered at night, its antique pipes groaning like old bones settling. The cypress. Floorboards still creaked in exactly the same places, creating an unintentional map of midnight wanderings. It was the house where I'd raised Noah these past 3 months, while cancer consumed my father one cell at a time, as the world beyond these walls continued its relentless march forward. When Dad received his diagnosis, Rebecca's response was efficient and distant, exactly like the relationship they'd cultivated. She arranged for top oncologists, coordinated with prestigious treatment centers, set up a dedicated medical concierge service, all from her London office. She sent extravagant fruit baskets to the house weekly with cards signed by her entire family, none of whom had actually written them. She scheduled precisely timed video calls that never lasted longer than 30 minutes, and always ended with, "I've got to run to a meeting, Dad. The Secretary General is waiting." Rebecca had excuses polished to perfection, a crucial united. Nation Summit she was keynoting, an emergency board meeting for her foundation, a diplomatic reception at Buckingham Palace she simply couldn't miss. She'd constructed the exact life Dad had always envisioned for a Sullivan, internationally respected, professionally irreplaceable, perpetually in demand. And in his eyes, that made her absences not just forgivable, but appropriate. Important. People had important obligations. But it was me who witnessed his body betraying him day by day. It was me who learned to interpret the different qualities of his pain. Sharp meant increase the dose, dull meant offer distraction, absent meant prepare for the inevitable. It was me who sat beside him during chemotherapy sessions that ultimately proved futile. It was me who knew which classical pieces still brought him comfort when nothing else could penetrate his suffering. I was there when the morphine made him vulnerable enough to whisper fragments of regret between labored breaths. When he clutched my hand one night and confessed, "I think I missed everything that actually mattered." I was there when he finally asked, "Ella, would you help me record something? There are words I need to say while I still can." I found his digital video camera buried beneath architectural drawings of his final commercial project, a performing arts center that would bear the Sullivan name but which he would never see completed. The camera was practically obsolete technology in this age of smartphones, but Dad had always preferred tools he understood. He insisted on sitting up for the recording, refusing to be filmed lying down. "No one listens to a man who can't sit. Upright," he said, a flash of his old stubbornness returning. I positioned the camera on a stack of books, framing him against the mahogany bookshelves that had always served as the backdrop for family photographs. He waved away my offer to clean him up, to shave the patchy stubble or help him into a fresh shirt. "No," he said firmly. "This needs to be real. Everything else has been so carefully arranged." He recorded steadily for almost 20 minutes, stopping occasionally when pain or emotion overwhelmed him, but always insisting on continuing. When he finished, he nodded once, definitively, and handed me the camera. "The truth matters, Ella," he said, his voice raspier than before. "Even when it arrives late." He fell asleep soon after, his breathing shallow but peaceful. 2 days later, he slipped away without waking, Rebecca's daily video call missed by 3 hours. I didn't immediately watch what he'd recorded. I couldn't. I was suddenly responsible for funeral arrangements, legal notifications, coordinating with the family attorney, and preparing the house for the influx of relatives who would descend like well-dressed ravens. And beneath all these practical concerns lurked a deeper fear. What if his final message was just more of the same? More praise for Rebecca's accomplishments, more gentle disappointment in my choices, more evidence that I'd never quite measured, up to the Sullivan standard? So I transferred the video to a flash drive and tucked it away, not yet ready to face whatever final thoughts my father had deemed important enough to preserve. Let me tell you more about who we were before that moment. In the cathedral changed everything. I'm Ella Sullivan Reeves, widow, mother, preserver of historical architecture. After graduating with honors from Georgia Tech's architecture program, an achievement that earned a perfunctory nod from my father, while Rebecca's master's degree ceremony warranted a catered celebration, I specialized in restoring buildings, others considered beyond salvation. I find beauty in what remains after damage, potential in structures others would demolish. My husband Michael understood this about me. He recognized my need to prove that broken things still held value, still deserved attention and care. Michael died suddenly 3 years ago, an undetected heart condition that took him in his sleep at just 42. He left me with Noah, mountains, of medical debt despite good insurance, and a profound understanding of how quickly certainties can dissolve. We downsized from our restored Victorian to a modest craftsman bungalow in a neighboring city. I took on more commercial projects that paid reliably but offered less creative satisfaction. I learned to be both parents to a grieving 10-year-old while processing my own loss. Noah is my miracle, my reason for pushing forward when retreat seems simpler. 13 now, with Michael's thoughtful eyes and my stubborn chin, he navigates the world with a sensitivity that sometimes worries me and often humbles me. While other boys his age are consumed by video games and social hierarchies, Noah notices the elderly woman struggling with grocery bags, the classmate eating lunch, alone, the substitute teacher nobody respects. He feels deeply, questions constantly, and somehow slices through adult pretenses with innocent precision. Why does Aunt Rebecca talk so much about helping children in other countries but never asks about me? He wondered once after a particularly performative video call. Or, why does Grandpa hang all those awards on his wall but none of the drawings I've sent him? Questions that left me fumbling for answers that wouldn't sound like criticism, but wouldn't be lies either. The only person who seemed to truly connect with Noah was, surprisingly, my father, but only in these final months of his life. As cancer stripped away Dad's carefully constructed armor of achievement and authority, a different person began emerging, one who actually listened when Noah talked about astronomy or sketch comedy or the novel he was writing, one who asked questions instead of delivering judgments. One who, when Noah brought his latest science project to show, said simply, "You see the world differently. That's a gift, not a problem." This unexpected bond between them confused me initially. Patrick Sullivan had been a formidable father, demanding, critical, perpetually disappointed that I hadn't embraced the family's business legacy. His approval had always been conditional, his attention reserved for achievements that reflected well on the Sullivan name. He'd been especially hard on me after Mom disappeared, as though my emotional response to her abandonment was somehow more embarrassing than the abandonment itself. "Sullivan women are stronger than this," he'd say when he found me crying. "Rebecca has managed to stay focused on her college applications despite everything." And it was true. Rebecca channeled everything into achievement, collecting accolades like armor against feeling anything too deeply. I turned inward instead, finding solace in art and eventually architecture, in the belief that broken things could be made beautiful again if someone cared enough to try. But cancer had rewritten some essential code in my father. During one particularly difficult night, when pain had stripped away his usual reserve, he gripped my hand and whispered, "I pushed her away, you know. Your mother. I made her feel small until she disappeared entirely." The confession hung between us, too monumental to acknowledge directly. Instead, I adjusted his pillows and pretended not to notice the tears tracking silently down his hollowed cheeks. Another evening, as I helped him sip water through a straw, he looked at me with sudden clarity. "You're like her, not just your appearance. the way you see beauty in damaged things. I never understood that. Thought it was impractical. He closed his eyes briefly. I was wrong about so many things, Ella. These moments were transformative, but fragile. Gossamer threads of connection that could snap under the weight of old patterns. Sometimes he would retreat back into his former self, criticizing my sentimental approach to his medical decisions or comparing my career unfavorably to Rebecca's international prominence. But increasingly, as the disease progressed, those reflexive judgments gave way to something more authentic, more vulnerable, more real than anything we'd shared in 40 years of carefully choreographed father-daughter interactions. The cathedral filled quickly on the morning of the funeral. St. Andrew's was the spiritual center of Westmore, its soaring Gothic architecture and historical significance making it the only appropriate venue for laying to rest a man of Patrick Sullivan's stature. The memorial service had been meticulously planned according to instructions Rebecca had emailed to the funeral director, from the selection of hymns, dignified, traditional, to the precise arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus, elegant, masculine, to the printed programs, heavyweight cream cardstock with embossed family crest. I sat in the front pew with Noah, his slender frame uncomfortable in the new suit we'd purchased for the occasion. He kept adjusting his tie, a miniature version of the Sullivan men's traditional burgundy and navy stripe. I'd debated whether to force this formality on him, but ultimately decided some battles weren't worth fighting. Besides, Dad would have approved of Noah's appearance, and that small posthumous connection seemed important to preserve. The cathedral hummed with hushed conversations, distinguished business associates in bespoke suits, philanthropic partners with appropriate expressions of somber reflection, political figures whose campaigns had benefited from Sullivan donations, cousins who appeared at family functions like seasonal decorations, predictable in their timing but never quite fitting in with the permanent household, all gathered to pay respects to a man whose public persona had been carefully crafted over decades of strategic relationship building. I felt their glances, some curious, some sympathetic, some assessing. The Sullivan daughter who'd stayed local, who'd chosen a modest career restoring old buildings rather than constructing empires or international reputations, the one whose husband had died young, leaving her with a son in circumstances that required her to actually work for a living rather than chair charitable galas. I'd long ago stopped caring about these assessments, but today they scraped against raw emotions, leaving me feeling exposed and defensive. Rebecca arrived 7 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin, making an entrance that somehow managed to be both appropriately subdued and impossible to ignore. James, her diplomat, husband walked beside her, his posture military straight, his handshake perfect as he greeted key attendees. Their twin daughters, Sophia and Isabel, followed 3 steps behind, their matching black dresses and impeccable manners a testament to their exclusive Swiss boarding school. The girls were 15 now, though I barely recognized them. Our interactions had been limited to Christmas cards and occasional video calls that Rebecca orchestrated like press conferences. Rebecca moved through the gathering with practiced grace, accepting condolences with just the right balance of composure and visible grief. When she finally reached the front pew, she embraced me briefly, a camera-ready gesture that conveyed familial unity without requiring actual emotional connection. "Everything looks perfect," she whispered, though her tone suggested she was claiming credit rather than expressing gratitude. "The governor just arrived. I've arranged for him to speak briefly about Dad's contributions to the state infrastructure projects." I nodded, not bothering to mention that I'd spent hours with the florist ensuring the arrangements included sprigs of rosemary, Dad's favorite herb from the garden he'd tended in rare moments of relaxation, or that I'd selected readings that actually reflected his personal literary preferences rather than just his public persona. These details would go unnoticed by Rebecca, whose understanding of our father had always been filtered through the lens of strategic advantage rather than genuine knowing. She glanced at Noah, seemingly noticing him for the first time. "You look very handsome, Noah," she said with the slightly exaggerated tone adults often use with children they don't know well. "Your grandfather would be proud." Noah nodded politely. "Thank you, Aunt Rebecca." His eyes, however, held that contemplative look I recognized, the one that meant he was observing more than he was saying. He'd spent enough time with my father during these last months to form his own impressions, uninfluenced by family mythology or social expectations. The service proceeded according to Rebecca's carefully orchestrated program. The minister spoke of Patrick Sullivan's community leadership, his business acumen, his generous philanthropic contributions. The governor praised his vision for urban development. A longtime business partner reminisced about their first major project together. The cathedral choir performed a technically perfect but emotionally sterile rendition of Amazing Grace. Throughout it all, I felt increasingly disconnected, as though we were memorializing a character rather than the complex, flawed, and ultimately human man I had come to know during his final days. Then, according to the program, came time for remarks from the family. Rebecca approached the podium with measured steps, her composure absolute. She arranged herself perfectly, hands resting lightly on either side of the polished wood, allowing a moment of silence to command attention before beginning. "My father," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the vaulted space, "understood the power of legacy. Everything he built, his business, his reputation, his influence, was constructed with an eye toward what would remain after he was gone." She paused, allowing a small smile. "He often told me that buildings were important, but it was the people you shaped who truly carried your impact forward." She spoke for several minutes about Patrick Sullivan's vision, his determination, his unwavering standards. She shared carefully selected anecdotes that portrayed him as demanding but fair, exacting but generous. Each story reinforced the public image he had cultivated for decades, while simultaneously emphasizing her position as his natural heir in both temperament and achievement. Then she shifted slightly, her voice becoming more intimate. "What many of you may not know is that during our last conversation, just days before he left us, my father entrusted me with both his business concerns and his most personal wishes." She paused, allowing a slight catch in her voice, a perfectly calibrated display of controlled emotion. "He told me that seeing me continue his work, both professionally and philanthropically, gave him peace in his final days. 'Rebecca,' he said, 'you are my greatest legacy.'" The statement hung in the air, simultaneously believable and utterly false. Rebecca had indeed spoken with Dad by video call shortly before he died, but it had been a brief, awkward conversation, during which he'd been heavily medicated and barely responsive. I know because I was holding his hand throughout the entire 12-minute exchange, watching as Rebecca showed him photographs of a humanitarian award she'd recently received, never once asking how he was feeling or if he needed anything. "He asked me to ensure that his vision continues," Rebecca was saying now, "both for Sullivan Development and for the Sullivan Family Foundation. It's a responsibility I accept with deep humility and absolute commitment." The cathedral remained respectfully silent, but I could feel the subtle shift in energy as people processed this information. Rebecca wasn't just claiming emotional primacy as the favored daughter. She was effectively announcing her assumption of control over Dad's considerable business interests and philanthropic endeavors. She was rewriting the narrative even as we sat beside his casket. I felt Noah stiffen beside me. He looked up, his expression troubled. "That's not what happened," he whispered. "That's not what Grandpa said at all." I squeezed his hand gently, unsure how to respond. Rebecca had always been skilled at reshaping reality to fit her preferred narrative. Throughout our childhood, she'd perfected the art of positioning herself at the center of every family story, gradually erasing my contributions until even I began to doubt my own memories. Dad had enabled this revisionism, perhaps because Rebecca's version of events always aligned more closely with his desired family image. In honor of his wishes, Rebecca continued, I'll be relocating back to the States to personally oversee the Sullivan enterprises. James and the girls will join me once the school term ends. We'll be reopening the family foundation offices and expanding our community initiatives, just as Dad envisioned. I felt a jolt of surprise. This was the first I'd heard of any such plan. Dad's will hadn't even been read yet. That meeting with the family attorney was scheduled for tomorrow. Yet Rebecca was already publicly claiming authority over decisions that, legally speaking, hadn't yet been determined. It was a strategic move, creating a public expectation that would make any other outcome seem like a disruption of Dad's wishes. Noah's hand slipped into his jacket pocket, where I knew he'd stored the flash drive containing Dad's final message. He'd asked to watch it with me 2 nights ago, arguing that as someone who'd been close to Grandpa at the end, he deserved to hear what had been said. I'd relented, partly because I needed moral support to face whatever was on that recording, partly because Noah had earned the right to this truth through the genuine relationship he'd built with my father. What we'd witnessed together on that recording had left us both stunned into silence. Not because it was shocking in content, but because it represented such a profound departure from the Patrick Sullivan that the world knew. It was raw, vulnerable, and more honest than I'd ever heard my father speak in his entire life. Mom, Noah whispered now, his eyes fixed on Rebecca as she continued her carefully constructed speech. People should know. He wanted them to know. That's why he made the video. I hesitated, caught between lifelong patterns of acquiescence and the growing certainty that something important was at stake here. Not just the factual record of who said what to whom, but the deeper truth of who my father had been and what he had come to understand at the end of his life. The truth that might, if heard, begin to heal wounds that had been festering in our family for generations. Rebecca was concluding her remarks now, her voice solemn yet confident. As we say goodbye to Patrick Sullivan today, I make this promise. His vision will not diminish. His standards will not lower. His legacy is secure in my hands. She touched the casket lightly before returning to her seat, accepting James's supportive arm and the appreciative murmurs from those seated nearby. The minister stepped forward again, preparing to lead the congregation in a final hymn before the pallbearers would carry the casket to the waiting hearse. The service was nearly complete. The official narrative was being sealed into place, one that would shape not just memories of my father, but the future direction of everything he had built. Noah looked at me, the flash drive now visible in his palm. Should I? He asked simply. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of decades of silence pressing against my chest. I thought about all the times I'd stepped back, stayed quiet, accepted the stories others told about me and my place in the family. I thought about the man my father had become in those final weeks, not the titan of industry or the stern patriarch, but someone more human, more vulnerable, more real than he'd allowed himself to be for most of his life. Most of all, I thought about what he'd said on that recording. The truth matters, Ella, even when it arrives late. I opened my eyes and nodded to my son. Noah stood before I could second-guess our decision. He moved toward the front of the cathedral with a certainty that belied his 13 years. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clear, though not particularly loud. Yet something in his tone caused the congregation to fall silent, the minister to pause mid-motion, Rebecca to turn, with a questioning expression. "Before we finish," Noah continued, "there's something my grandfather recorded that he wanted people to hear." Rebecca's face shifted from confusion to alarm. "Ella," she hissed across the pew that separated us. "What is happening right now?" I rose and walked to join my son, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Dad recorded a message before he died," I explained, my voice calmer than I felt. "I think it's important that we honor his final wishes by sharing it." The minister looked uncertain, glancing between Rebecca and me as though trying to determine the proper protocol for this unexpected development. Rebecca stood abruptly. "This is completely inappropriate," she said, her composed facade cracking slightly. "We have a program. We have guests waiting. Whatever personal message Dad might have left can be shared privately, not turned into some kind of spectacle." I met her gaze directly, something I'd rarely done throughout our lives. "This isn't about creating a spectacle, Rebecca. It's about letting Dad speak for himself. One last time." Noah held up the flash drive. "Grandpa made this 2 days before he died. He was really clear about wanting people to hear it." A murmur rippled through the cathedral. I could feel the shift in energy, curiosity, discomfort, anticipation. The Sullivan family rarely displayed anything but perfect unity in public. This moment of visible discord was already breaching decades of carefully maintained appearances. The technical coordinator for the cathedral approached hesitantly. "If you'd like, we can connect that to the system. The screens are already set up for the photo memorial." Rebecca stepped forward, her smile tight. "This is neither the time nor the place," she insisted, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent those nearby from hearing. "Dad would never have wanted his funeral turned into some kind of impromptu video viewing." "Actually," I replied, matching her quiet tone, "that's exactly what he wanted. If you'd been here during those last weeks, you'd know that." The words hung between us, sharp and undeniable. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. For a moment, I glimpsed something vulnerable beneath her perfect facade. Perhaps hurt, perhaps guilt, perhaps simply the recognition that she had miscalculated. Then her diplomatic training reasserted itself. "Fine," she said tightly. "But if this is inappropriate in any way—" "It's Dad's own words," I interrupted. "How could that be inappropriate at his own funeral?" The technical coordinator had connected the flash drive to the cathedral's system. The large screens on either side of the altar that had earlier displayed hymn lyrics and photographs now showed a loading icon. Noah returned to stand beside me, his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered to him. He nodded. Grandpa wanted the truth to matter. That's what he kept saying. The screens flickered, and then my father's face appeared, filling the displays. The recording had been made in his study, books lining the shelves behind him, afternoon light casting soft shadows across his gaunt features. He looked directly into the camera, his once commanding presence diminished by illness, but his eyes, more present, more alive than they had been in years. The cathedral fell completely silent as his voice, weaker than the congregation remembered but unmistakably Patrick Sullivan, filled the sacred space. "If someone is watching this," he began, "then I've run out of time. And there are things that need to be said while I still can say them." The cathedral fell into a profound silence as my father's image filled the screens. His once commanding presence was now visibly diminished, his broad shoulders hunched, his face gaunt from months of aggressive treatment. But his eyes, those piercing blue Sullivan eyes, held a clarity and purpose that had been absent for weeks before his death. He looked directly into the camera with an intensity that made it feel as though he were present with us. One final time. "There comes a moment in every person's life," he began, his voice raspier than the congregation remembered but still carrying that unmistakable Sullivan authority, "when you realize time is no longer a luxury you can afford to waste. For me, that moment came 3 months ago in a sterile doctor's office when a specialist I'd never met before told me I had weeks, maybe months to live." He paused, drawing a labored breath that echoed through the cathedral's perfect acoustics. "When you're told your days are numbered, you start counting different things. Not dollars or buildings or achievements. You count moments you wasted, truths you buried, people you failed." A soft gasp rippled through the pews. This unvarnished honesty was so unlike the Patrick Sullivan most people knew, the man who crafted his public persona with the same precision he demanded in his architectural blueprints. "I've spent my life building things meant to outlast me," he continued. "Skyscrapers that will stand for generations, a company that employs hundreds, a foundation that feeds thousands. I believed these structures would be my legacy." His mouth twisted in what might have been a smile or a grimace. "I was wrong. They're just things. Important things, perhaps, but not what matters most in the final counting." Rebecca shifted, uncomfortably beside me. I could feel her tension radiating across the space between us. This wasn't the carefully scripted posthumous message she had anticipated. Not a neat transferal of authority or blessing on her assumption of control. This was something far more raw and unpredictable. "I've made many mistakes in my life," Dad continued, "but none greater than how I failed my daughters. Rebecca." He looked directly into the camera, as if he could see her sitting in the cathedral months later. "I pushed you relentlessly toward achievement, toward a perfection no human could possibly maintain. I taught you that your value came from what you accomplished, not who you are. I modeled a life where appearances mattered more than authenticity, where strategic relationships outweighed genuine connections, and you learned those lessons too well." Another collective intake of breath echoed through the cathedral. Rebecca's face had gone completely still, her practiced composure suddenly rigid rather than fluid. On screen, Dad looked down briefly, gathering strength, then raised his eyes again. "You built exactly the life I told you to build. Impressive on paper, admired by strangers, empty of the things that actually sustain a human heart. I'm so sorry for that burden I placed on you. Your worth was never dependent on your achievements. I wish I had told you that. I wish I had shown you that." Tears were now streaming unchecked down Rebecca's face. James reached for her hand, but she pulled away slightly, as if physical comfort might break the last threads of her composure. I felt a complex wave of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also deep sadness for my sister, whose carefully constructed world was being fundamentally challenged by the man who had helped her build it. Dad shifted position slightly, wincing from what must have been pain. "And Ella." His voice softened as he spoke my name in a way I had rarely heard during his life. "My quiet daughter, the one who absorbed every criticism, every dismissal, every comparison. The one who somehow maintained her humanity despite my best efforts to prioritize achievement over compassion." I felt tears building behind my eyes, hot and insistent. Noah's hand found mine, squeezing gently as his grandfather's posthumous words filled the cathedral. "I didn't understand you for most of your life. Your sensitivity seemed like weakness to me. Your creative vision appeared impractical. Your choice to restore rather than demolish and rebuild made no sense to my bottom-line thinking." He paused, a look of profound regret crossing his features. "But these last months, as you've cared for me, as I've watched you with Noah, I've finally recognized what I was too blind to see before. Your strength isn't about dominating rooms or closing deals. It's about sustaining life, preserving what matters, creating space for truth and healing." The cathedral remained absolutely silent, hundreds of people collectively holding their breath as this unexpected revelation unfolded. I could feel the weight of every gaze alternating between the screen and me, reassessing years of assumptions about the Sullivan family dynamics. "The irony isn't lost on me," Dad continued with a pained smile, "that you chose a career preserving historic architecture, finding value in what others would tear down, while I failed to appreciate the history and value within my own family. You stayed when everyone else left. You showed up when it wasn't convenient or advantageous. You saw me, really saw me, at my worst and still offered kindness." He looked away briefly, And I remembered that moment during the recording when he'd needed to collect himself. When he turned back to the camera, his eyes were damp but determined. If I could build my life again, I would construct it more like yours, on a foundation of genuine connections rather than strategic advantages, on walls of compassion rather than competition. I would measure success not by the height of my achievements, but by the depth of my relationships. Noah's grip on my hand tightened. On my other side, I sensed rather than saw Rebecca's stillness, the rigid control she was exerting to maintain her composure in front of hundreds of witnesses to this unexpected revelation. "I'm leaving instructions with my attorney," Dad continued, his voice growing slightly stronger as he addressed practical matters. "The Sullivan Company and Foundation should be restructured. Ella will have equal voice in all decisions moving forward. Her perspective is essential to creating the kind of legacy that actually matters." A murmur rippled through the cathedral. This wasn't just an emotional reconciliation, it was a fundamental redistribution of power within the Sullivan empire. Several board members exchanged glances. The family attorney, seated near the front, nodded slightly, unsurprised by this announcement. "Rebecca," Dad addressed my sister directly again, "this isn't about diminishing your contributions or abilities. It's about recognizing that your sister brings something essential that has been missing, something I failed to value properly. Together, you could build something truly meaningful, not just impressive, but genuinely good." He shifted again, grimacing slightly, and I remembered how difficult it had been for him to sit upright for this recording, how he had refused additional pain medication because he wanted his mind clear for what he needed to say. "There's something else I need to address," he said, his tone changing subtly. "Something I've never spoken about publicly. Diana, your mother, didn't just leave us. I drove her away with my impossible standards, my emotional unavailability, my stubborn refusal to change. She begged me for years to seek help, to learn how to connect, to put family above business. I dismissed her concerns as weakness, as distraction from what I thought mattered." Around the cathedral, people shifted uncomfortably. My mother's disappearance had been the subject of community speculation for 2 decades, carefully managed by my father's influence to minimize scandal. This public acknowledgement of his role in her departure was unprecedented. "She wanted to take you both with her," Dad continued, each word clearly causing him effort. "But I threatened to use every resource at my disposal to destroy her if she tried. I used my connections, my wealth, my influence as weapons to keep control. It was unforgivable." He closed his eyes briefly. "I've spent 20 years cultivating the fiction that she abandoned her family, when the truth is that I gave her an impossible choice: leave alone or face complete destruction." I felt as though the floor beneath me had suddenly vanished. All these years, I had carried the weight of my mother's abandonment, the inexplicable pain of being left behind. Dad had encouraged our perception of her as selfish, unstable, unworthy of the Sullivan name. To learn now that he had orchestrated the entire separation, had deliberately crafted a narrative that protected him while demonizing her, it was almost too much to process. "I tell you this now," Dad continued, "not to burden you with an old man's guilt, but because you deserve the truth. Both of you. Diana loved you fiercely. Her leaving wasn't a rejection of you, but the only choice I left. I've tried to find her over the years to make amends, but she disappeared completely. Perhaps that was her final act of self-preservation against a man who never understood the difference between possessing someone and loving them." Beside me, Rebecca had gone completely still. This revelation struck at the very foundation of the narrative she had built her life around, that our mother had been weak, irresponsible, unworthy of the Sullivan name. That strength meant never showing vulnerability, never prioritizing emotion over achievement, that her own approach to life, disciplined, strategic, achievement-oriented, was the correct response to abandonment. "I'm telling you all of this," Dad said, his voice growing more strained. "Because lies, even well-intentioned ones, create distance. They build walls between people that eventually become impossible to scale. I've lived behind those walls for most of my life, and I'm dying, alone because of them." He paused, gathering his remaining strength. "Don't make my mistakes. Don't sacrifice connection for achievement. Don't confuse admiration with love. Don't wait until it's too late to speak truth to the people who matter." He leaned closer to the camera, his blue eyes intense despite the illness that had ravaged his body. "Ella has the video camera. If she's showing you this, it means she's finally found the courage to claim her rightful place. Listen to her. She understands something about preservation, not just of buildings, but of what makes us human, that I recognized too late." The recording continued for another minute, with Dad offering specific apologies to people in his life. His brother Marcus, his longtime assistant Vivian, several business associates he had treated harshly over the years. But the focus of his message had been clear: a public recognition of his failures as a father, an acknowledgement of his role in our mother's disappearance, and a clear directive about my place in the family business moving forward. As the screen faded to black, the cathedral remained utterly silent. No one coughed, shifted, or whispered. It was as if my father's words had cast a spell over the congregation, suspending them in a moment of collective reckoning with a man, very different from the one they thought they had come to memorialize. The minister finally broke the silence, stepping forward with visible uncertainty about how to proceed after such an unexpected deviation from the carefully planned service. Let us pray," he offered, his professional training providing a path forward when none was clear. As heads bowed around us, I remained upright, watching Rebecca. Her face had transformed during our father's recording, the perfect composure cracking to reveal something raw and wounded beneath. She didn't look at me immediately. Instead, she stared at the now dark screen as if expecting, perhaps hoping, that more would follow. Some qualification, some retraction, some return to the narrative she had built her identity around. When the prayer concluded and the congregation murmured their Amen, Rebecca finally turned toward me. The look we exchanged wasn't simple enough to name. It wasn't just shock or anger or betrayal or validation. It was recognition, the kind that strips away decades of carefully constructed fiction and forces a confrontation with something more fundamental and true. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the perfect acoustics of the cathedral. "Why spring this here now in front of everyone?" I held her gaze steadily. "Would you have listened if I'd shown you privately? Or would you have found a way to dismiss it, reframe it, or prevent others from seeing it?" The question hung between us, unanswered because we both knew the truth. Rebecca had spent a lifetime controlling narratives, managing perceptions, ensuring that reality aligned with her preferred version of events. This public revelation had bypassed her ability to filter or reshape Dad's words. The pallbearers were moving toward the casket now, preparing for the procession to the cemetery. The congregation began to stir, an uncertain murmuring replacing the usual dignified exit from a memorial service. I could see people glancing our way, their expressions revealing recalibrations of long-held assumptions about the Sullivan family. James appeared at Rebecca's side, his diplomatic training evident in his calm demeanor despite the obvious tension. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately," he suggested, placing a supportive hand at the small of Rebecca's back. After the interment, Rebecca nodded slightly, her professional instincts for damage control reasserting themselves. "Yes," she agreed, straightening her shoulders and arranging her features into something approaching her usual composed expression. "This isn't the place for family discussions." "That's exactly what Dad thought for 40 years," I replied quietly. That truth was something to be managed privately rather than acknowledged openly. How did that work out for our family? For just a moment, something shifted in Rebecca's eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even the beginning of understanding. Then it was gone, replaced by the practiced neutrality that had served her so well in diplomatic circles. We'll talk. Later, she said, turning to follow the casket as it was carried down the center aisle. I watched her go, feeling strangely calm despite the emotional earthquake that had just occurred. Noah stood beside me, his young face solemn but satisfied. You did the right thing, he said simply. Grandpa wanted people to hear the truth. Now they have. We followed the procession outside, where spring sunlight bathed the cathedral steps, in golden warmth that seemed at odds with the somber occasion. The crowd moved differently now, clusters forming and reforming as people processed what they had witnessed. I caught fragments of whispered conversations. Never seen anything like it in all my years. Always suspected there was more to Diana's disappearance. The way he looked when he talked about Ella. The familiar weight of invisibility that had accompanied me throughout my life in Westmore had lifted. Not because I suddenly mattered more in these people's estimation, but because I no longer needed their recognition to validate my place in my own family story. Dad's final message hadn't just been about redistributing power or correcting the record. It had been about acknowledging the value of a different kind of strength than the one he had spent his life pursuing. As we approached the waiting limousines, Uncle Marcus stepped beside me. My father's younger brother had always been the gentler Sullivan, the one who chose teaching over business, who married for love rather than advantage, who attended family functions out of genuine desire rather than obligation. He'd been a quiet ally throughout my childhood, though never quite brave enough to directly challenge my father's parenting approach. He told me he was making that recording, Marcus said softly. I didn't know what he planned to say, but I knew it was important to him. He glanced toward Rebecca, who was now speaking with the mayor several yards away, her public face firmly back in place. This won't be easy for her. Her entire identity is built around being Patrick Sullivan's perfect heir. It wasn't easy for me being Patrick Sullivan's disappointing daughter for 40 years, I replied, not unkindly but truthfully. Sometimes the hardest gift we can receive is the invitation to become more authentic, even when it challenges everything. We thought we knew about ourselves. Marcus studied me with newfound respect. When did you get so wise, Ella? I smiled slightly. Somewhere between heartbreaks and healing, I suppose. Loss has a way of clarifying what actually matters. We had reached the limousines now. Protocol dictated that Rebecca and I would ride together in the first car, with James and the twins following in the second, and Noah joining my cousins in the third. I hesitated, suddenly reluctant to spend the next 30 minutes in confined silence with a sister who likely viewed me as having publicly humiliated her. But to my surprise, Rebecca approached directly, her expression determined but no longer closed. Ride with me, she said. It wasn't quite a request, but neither was it her usual command. There was something different in her tone, a hint of vulnerability that I couldn't remember hearing since we were very young. I nodded, then turned to Noah. Will you be okay riding with Sophia and Isabel? He gave me a look of adolescent exasperation. I'm 13, Mom, not 3. Besides, he lowered his voice, I think you and Aunt Rebecca need to talk without an audience. I squeezed his shoulder, once again amazed by his emotional intelligence. When did you get so wise? He grinned, a flash of normal teenage lightheartedness breaking through the solemnity of the day. Dunno. Maybe Grandpa's good qualities skipped a generation. The drive to Westmore Cemetery would normally take 15 minutes, but the funeral procession moved at a stately pace, winding through streets lined with respectful onlookers. Inside the limousine, Rebecca and I sat in silence for the first several blocks, both staring straight ahead as oak-lined avenues passed by the tinted windows. "You could have warned me," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "Would it have made a difference?" I asked quietly. "Or would you have found a way to prevent it from being shown?" She didn't answer immediately, her fingers methodically, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "I didn't know," she said finally. "About Mom, about what he did." "I didn't either," I admitted. "Not until I watched the recording." Rebecca turned to look at me directly for the first time since we'd entered the car. "Did he really say all those things to you? About being proud? About valuing your approach?" The question contained layers of disbelief, jealousy, and something more vulnerable, a tentative reaching toward a truth she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear. I met her gaze steadily. "Yes, but only at the very end, when he had nothing left to lose or gain by pretending." I hesitated, then added, "It doesn't erase 40 years of making me feel invisible, Rebecca. Just like that recording doesn't erase your accomplishments or his genuine pride in you." She looked away, watching as we passed Sullivan Park, one of Dad's early philanthropic projects, a sprawling green space donated to the city 15 years ago. "I've built my entire life around being exactly what he wanted," she said softly, almost to herself. "Every decision, every achievement, every sacrifice was about meeting his standard. And now he tells the world, that he led me down the wrong path." I considered her words carefully. I don't think that's what he was saying. I think he was acknowledging that he set us both on paths that reflected his values, not necessarily what would fulfill us as individuals. He pushed you toward achievement and recognition because that's what he valued most. He dismissed my more emotional, preservation-focused approach because it didn't align with his definition of success. But in the end, he said your way was right, Rebecca said, a hint of her old competitive spirit flaring. "No," I corrected gently. "He said both perspectives have value, that together we could build something meaningful, not just impressive." He was trying, in his final moments, to give us permission to define success differently than he did. The limousine slowed as we approached the cemetery gates. Rebecca straightened, instinctively preparing to reassume her public persona. But, before she did, she turned to me once more. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've become," she admitted, vulnerability threading through her words. "I don't know how to measure myself by any other metric than achievement." For the first time in decades, I saw my sister, not the polished international humanitarian or the favored Sullivan daughter, but the girl who had also lost her mother, who had also tried to earn a complicated father's love, who had also constructed a life around filling an absence she couldn't quite name. "Maybe you don't have to figure that out all at once," I suggested as the car came to a stop. "Maybe this is just the beginning of a different conversation, with yourself, with the world, with what remains of our family." Rebecca nodded slowly, then reached for the door handle, but before opening it, she turned back once more. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for caring for him, for being there when I wasn't. I know it wasn't easy. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was an acknowledgement. Perhaps the first genuine one she had offered me in our adult lives. And in that moment, it felt like enough to build upon. He was our father," I said simply, "complicated, flawed, but ours. We both loved him in our own ways." As we stepped out into the cemetery's solemn quiet, I noticed Noah waiting beside the other cars. He watched us carefully, those perceptive eyes missing nothing. When I offered a small, reassuring smile, he visibly relaxed, seemingly satisfied that his brave action in the cathedral had initiated something healing rather than destructive. The graveside service was brief: scripture, prayers, the ceremonial lowering of the casket into the ground beside the plot where an empty casket for our mother had been buried years ago when she was declared legally deceased. Throughout the final rituals, I noticed a subtle shift in how people interacted with me. Where before there had been polite dismissal or vague sympathy, now there were direct gazes, respectful nods, a new quality of attention that acknowledged my central role in my father's final chapter. As the gathering began to disperse, moving toward the reception that would be held at the Sullivan estate, the family attorney approached. "Ms. Sullivan-Reeves," he addressed me formally, "there's been a change in tomorrow's reading of the will. Ms. Rebecca has requested that we proceed this evening instead. Would that be convenient for you?" I glanced toward Rebecca, who was speaking with James several yards away. She met my eyes briefly and nodded once. Not a command this time, but a request. I understood intuitively that she needed resolution, needed to know exactly what our father's legal, not just emotional, intentions had been. "Yes," I agreed. "That would be fine." The attorney nodded. 7 o'clock at the house, then. Just immediate family." He hesitated, then added, "Your father made some significant changes to his estate plan during his final month. I think you'll find them illuminating." As he moved away, Noah appeared at my side. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his young face serious. That was intense in there. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders, noticing with a pang that he was nearly as tall as me now, childhood slipping away incrementally with each passing month. "I'm okay," I assured him. "Better than I've been in a long time, actually." "Because people finally heard the truth?" he asked. I considered his question carefully. "Partly that," I acknowledged, "but mostly because I finally stopped being afraid of it myself." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "Grandpa told me once that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified." I smiled, recognizing my father's distinctive phrasing. "When did he tell you that?" "During one of our chess games. I was afraid to sacrifice my queen, even though it was the right move to win the game. He said sometimes you have to risk what seems most valuable to gain what truly matters." I tightened my arm around his shoulders, once again struck by how this remarkable child had managed to forge a genuine connection with my father in ways I had spent decades attempting. That sounds like something he would say, though I suspect he was better at giving that advice than following it himself. "Until the end," Noah pointed out. "He finally did it at the end." As we walked together toward the waiting cars, I reflected on the truth of Noah's observation. My father had finally risked his carefully constructed public image to acknowledge his mistakes and speak a more complex, messy truth. He had sacrificed the mythology he'd spent a lifetime building to offer something more authentic as his final legacy. And somehow, that belated courage had created an opening, not just for healing the past, but for constructing a different kind of future than any of us had imagined possible. The path ahead was uncertain. Rebecca and I would need to navigate a new relationship, one not defined by our traditional roles as favored and forgotten daughters. The Sullivan enterprises would require restructuring to accommodate a more balanced leadership approach. And there were deeper wounds still to address: the 2-decade absence of our mother, the years of emotional distance we had normalized, the patterns of communication that had allowed falsehoods to calcify into accepted truths. But for the first time since I could remember, I felt something like hope taking root alongside my grief. Not because everything had been magically resolved by my father's posthumous honesty, but because the possibility of authenticity had been introduced into a family system that had operated on carefully managed appearances for generations. As I helped Noah into the car that would take us back to the Sullivan estate, where hundreds of mourners would gather to honor a man few had truly known, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, my mother's eyes looking back at me from my own face. I wondered, not for the first time, where she was now, whether she had found the peace that had eluded her in our family. And I wondered if, somehow, she knew that the truth she had fought for had finally found its voice. "Ready?" Noah asked, bringing me back to the present moment. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Ready." I was beginning to understand that readiness wasn't about having all the answers or knowing exactly what came next. Sometimes it was simply about being willing to step forward into uncertainty, trusting that truth, however delayed, created better foundations than even the most convincing illusions. It's been 4 months since we laid my father to rest beneath the ancient oak in Westmore Cemetery. Summer has transformed the landscape, drenching the gardens in vibrant color and wrapping the afternoons in golden warmth. I often find myself sitting on the back terrace of the Sullivan estate, my home now, still strange to think of it that way, watching as Noah tends to the butterfly garden we planted where Dad's pristine lawn once stretched in immaculate, sterile perfection. "Mom, come look," Noah calls, his excitement palpable as a monarch butterfly emerges from its chrysalis, wings still damp and crumpled. "It's happening right now." I join him, crouching beside the milkweed plant where this small miracle is unfolding. Together, we watch in reverent silence as the butterfly slowly expands its wings, preparing for a life entirely different from the caterpillar it once was. Transformation, I've come to understand, is rarely comfortable, but often necessary. For butterflies and humans alike. "Grandpa would have loved this," Noah says confidently, his eyes never leaving the delicate creature. He told me once that he wished he'd paid more attention to small wonders instead of always chasing big accomplishments. I smile, continually, amazed by the relationship my son and father forged in those final months, one built on vulnerability rather than performance, on genuine connection rather than impressive achievements. "I think you're right," I agree, gently ruffling his hair. He was learning to see differently at the end. The reading of my father's will that evening after the funeral had stunned everyone, perhaps Rebecca most of all. We gathered in Dad's study, Rebecca, James, the twins, Noah, and me, while Mr. Harrington, the family attorney, distributed copies of the document that would define the Sullivan legacy moving forward. The provisions were clear and intentional. The Sullivan Development Company would be restructured as a benefit corporation with Rebecca and me serving as equal co-chairs. The Sullivan Family Foundation would continue its philanthropic work, but with a new focus on historic preservation and community revitalization, areas that aligned with my professional expertise. The family estate, contrary to everyone's expectations, was left to me rather than Rebecca, with the stipulation that it become not just a private residence, but a center for creative mentorship for underprivileged youth interested in architecture, design, and historic preservation. Most surprising of all was a sizable trust designated for locating Diana Sullivan, our mother, if she could be found, and providing her with both financial support and, if she wished, a role in the foundation's work. Dad had included a personal letter for her, sealed and entrusted to Mr. Harrington, its contents known only to my father. Rebecca had sat in stunned silence as Mr. Harrington methodically worked through each provision. When he finished, she didn't immediately speak, just stared at the document in her hands as though it might somehow rearrange itself into the inheritance she had expected, one that recognized her as the natural successor to the Sullivan Empire, with me as, at best, a minor beneficiary. "He can't have been in his right mind," James finally said, breaking the silence. "The medication, the illness, surely this represents a deviation from his actual intentions." Mr. Harrington shook his head. "I can assure you, Mr. Harrington, that Patrick was entirely lucid when he made these changes. We discussed his reasoning at length. He was quite intentional about these provisions." "When?" Rebecca asked, her voice unnaturally calm. "When did he make these changes?" "The final version was executed 3 weeks ago," the attorney replied, though he began the revision process shortly after his diagnosis. "After Ella moved in," Rebecca noted, something dangerous flickering in her expression. How convenient. I felt a familiar tension building, the prelude to a pattern we had enacted countless times throughout our lives. Rebecca would imply, I had manipulated or maneuvered for advantage. I would become defensive, then retreat into hurt silence. She would dominate the narrative through sheer force of personality. But something had shifted fundamentally during that cathedral service. The old script no longer felt inevitable. It wasn't convenience, Rebecca, I said quietly. It was presence. I was here. Every day. Not because I wanted anything from him, but because he needed someone to be. She flinched slightly but recovered quickly. I had responsibilities, international commitments. I couldn't just abandon everything to sit by his bedside for months. I know, I acknowledged, surprising us both with my lack of accusation. You built the life he taught you to value, one where professional achievements outweigh personal connections, where appearing successful matters more than being present. You followed his blueprint perfectly. And yet, she said bitterly, gesturing toward the will, it seems he changed the plans without informing the architect. Noah, who had been sitting quietly beside me, spoke up unexpectedly. He didn't change them, Aunt Rebecca. He corrected them. All eyes turned to my son, this young person who somehow managed to distill complex emotional truths into simple clarity. Rebecca looked momentarily taken aback, unused to being challenged by anyone, much less a 13-year-old nephew she barely knew. Grandpa told me once, Noah continued, undeterred by the sudden attention, that the mark of a great builder isn't never making mistakes. It's recognizing when the foundation is faulty and having the courage to fix it before the whole structure collapses. The silence that followed was different than before, not tense, but contemplative. I saw something shift in Rebecca's expression, a subtle relaxing of the rigid control she maintained over her public face. For just a moment, she looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the sister I remembered from our childhood before achievement became her armor. I don't know how to do this, she admitted finally, gesturing vaguely between us. I don't know how to be your sister instead of your competitor. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said to me in 20 years. I don't know either, I confessed. But maybe that's where we start, by acknowledging that neither of us knows how to build this particular thing, but we're both willing to try. That evening marked the beginning of a complicated journey, one with no blueprints or strategic plans, just two sisters attempting to dismantle decades of conditioned responses and construct something new from the rubble of what our father had built and then, in his final act, partially deconstructed. The transformation hasn't been easy or linear. Change rarely is, especially when it involves recalibrating a lifetime of ingrained patterns. Rebecca initially returned to London after the funeral, ostensibly to arrange the transfer of her professional responsibilities and prepare her family for relocation. But I suspected she also needed space to process everything that had occurred. The public revelation of our father's regrets, the unexpected restructuring of his legacy, the fundamental challenge to the narrative that had shaped her identity. For 3 weeks, we communicated primarily through brief, formal emails about practical matters, scheduling preliminary meetings with the company board, discussing the foundation's outstanding commitments, arranging for a professional inventory of the estate's contents. Her messages were perfectly polite, meticulously detailed, and completely devoid of emotional content. The old Rebecca, operating in her comfort zone of efficient management, rather than messy human connection. Then, exactly 1 month after the funeral, my phone rang at nearly midnight. I answered to the sound of Rebecca crying, something I hadn't witnessed since we were children. I found her letters, she said without preamble, her voice thick with emotion. Mom's letters. Dozens of them, all returned unopened. They were in a locked drawer in Dad's London office. I was clearing it out and found the key taped under his desk. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. What do they say? Everything, Rebecca whispered. She wrote to us for years, begging Dad to let her see us, explaining why she had to leave. His control, his emotional manipulation, his threats. She sent birthday cards, Christmas gifts, updates on her life. He kept it all from us, Ella. He made us believe she abandoned us when she was fighting to stay connected. The revelation hit me, like a physical blow. All those years of feeling unwanted, discarded by the one person who had shown me unconditional love, those feelings had been based on a deliberate fiction constructed by my father, a fiction designed to punish my mother and bind us more tightly to him through shared abandonment. Does she say where she went? Where she might be now? I asked, heart racing with the possibility of finding the missing piece of our family after so many years. The last letter is from 5 years ago, Rebecca said. She was living in Santa Fe, working as an art therapist at a children's hospital. She paused. Ella, there are photos of her with patients, of her garden, of her with a man. I think she might have remarried. She looks happy? I asked, surprised by how desperately I needed the answer to be yes. She does, Rebecca confirmed, her voice softening. She looks peaceful, like she finally found a place where she could breathe. Like she found her butterfly garden, I murmured, the image appearing unbidden in my mind. Rebecca was silent for a moment. I'm coming home tomorrow, she said finally. I'm bringing the letters, and I think we should try to find her. Together. That conversation marked a turning point. When Rebecca returned to Westmore, something had fundamentally shifted in her approach. She moved into the guest house rather than the main estate, giving Noah and me space while remaining close enough for daily interaction. She began attending the Sullivan development meetings in person rather than via video conference, listening more than directing. Most significantly, she started spending time with Noah, awkwardly at first, then with growing genuine interest in his perspective. He sees things differently, she observed one evening as we shared a rare glass of wine on the terrace after Noah had gone to bed. Not just people, but systems, patterns. It's like he instinctively understands the architecture of situations, what's supporting them, where the stress points are, which elements are decorative versus structural. I smiled, recognizing her shift into architectural metaphors, our shared language from childhood. He's always been that way. It made school challenging initially. Teachers don't always appreciate having their social hierarchies analyzed by an 8-year-old. I can imagine, Rebecca said with a small laugh. Then, more seriously, he reminds me of Mom sometimes. That same quiet perceptiveness. The way he watches before speaking. The comparison startled me, though once articulated, it seemed obvious. I never made that connection, but you're right. He has her way of listening, really listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. We should have been taught that. Skill, Rebecca said, swirling the wine in her glass, instead of always being trained to command attention, to perform, to impress. Dad didn't know how to value it, I replied. He only recognized power that announced itself loudly. Rebecca nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand how much I internalized that perspective, how much it's shaped every choice I've made. She looked at me directly. I'm working with a therapist, Ella, for the first time in my life. James insisted, actually, after everything that happened at the funeral. He said he's been watching me become more like Dad for years, and he's worried about what that's doing to our marriage, to the girls. The admission clearly cost her this acknowledgement of seeking help, something our father would have viewed as weakness, as failure. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. That takes courage, I said simply. Real courage, not the performative kind we were taught. To value, our search for Diana Sullivan began methodically, utilizing resources from both our professional networks. Rebecca's diplomatic connections helped navigate international records. My restoration work had put me in touch with historical societies and community preservation groups throughout the Southwest. We hired a private investigator specializing in family reunifications, providing him with the Santa Fe address from the most recent letter and the photographs that showed our mother's face. Older, more lined than in our memories, but with the same gentle eyes and determined chin that Noah had inherited. 3 weeks into the search, on a sweltering July afternoon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar New Mexico area code. I answered, my heart racing with anticipation and fear in equal measure. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely steady. "Ella?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, slightly raspier than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "Ella, is it really you?" "Mom," I whispered, sinking onto the nearest chair as my legs suddenly refused to support me. "Yes, it's me." There was a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. "Oh, my darling girl, I've dreamed of hearing your voice for so long." We talked for over 2 hours that first call, words tumbling out in a chaotic stream as 2 decades of separation tried to compress into a single conversation. She told me about her life in Santa Fe, about rebuilding herself after leaving Westmore, about her work with traumatized children, using art to help them express what they couldn't say in words. She told me about finding love again with Robert, a kind pediatric surgeon who had never tried to control or diminish her. She told me how she had tried repeatedly to contact us, only to have every attempt blocked by my father's considerable influence. "I never abandoned you, Ella," she said, her voice breaking. "Leaving you and Rebecca was like leaving my own heart behind. But your father made it clear that if I tried to take you, he would use every resource to destroy me and traumatize you both in the process. I had to make an impossible choice: disappear, completely, or subject all of us to years of vicious legal battles that would have torn you apart." "I understand now," I assured her, tears flowing freely. "Dad told us the truth before he died. He admitted what he'd done." There was a long silence on the other end. "Patrick admitted it?" she finally asked, disbelief evident in her tone. "After all these years of maintaining his version of events?" "He changed at the end," I explained. "The illness stripped away a lot of his defenses. He recorded a message for us, for everyone really, acknowledging his mistakes. It was his final gift, I think, a chance at healing what he had broken." 2 weeks later, Diana Sullivan, now Diana Oakhurst, stepped off a plane at Atlanta International Airport. Rebecca and I waited side by side at the arrival gate, both of us uncharacteristically nervous, shifting our weight and checking the time repeatedly. Noah stood slightly ahead of us, holding a hand-painted sign that read simply, "Welcome home." When she appeared, it was like witnessing a ghost materialize into solid form. She was both exactly as I remembered and completely different, her dark hair now silver at the temples, her slender frame more angular, her movements more deliberate. But her eyes, those were unchanged, still radiating the warmth and depth that had made her presence in our childhood home feel like sanctuary amid my father's demanding standards. She saw Noah first, her steps faltering as she registered his resemblance to both me and herself. Then her gaze traveled to Rebecca and me, standing awkwardly side by side, no longer the little girls she had left behind, but grown women with lives and wounds and resilience she knew nothing about. For a moment, no one moved. The busy airport continued its choreographed chaos around us, but we remained frozen in a bubble of suspended time, 3 generations of a fractured family on the precipice of something new. Noah, as usual, bridged the gap. He stepped forward with the direct simplicity of youth and said, "Hi, Grandma. I'm Noah. I've been waiting my whole life to meet you." Diana's composure broke then. She dropped her carry-on bag and embraced him, tears flowing freely as she held the grandson she hadn't known existed until our phone call 2 weeks earlier. Over his shoulder, her eyes met mine, then Rebecca's, silently asking permission, seeking welcome. Rebecca moved first, surprising me. She stepped forward and joined the embrace, her usual poise abandoned as she folded herself against the mother she had spent 2 decades believing had willingly left her. I followed, completing the circle, and we stood there amid the airport, crowds, holding each other as though the years of separation might be compressed and healed through the simple power of physical connection. That was the beginning of a new chapter for the Sullivan women, one that continues to unfold in unexpected ways. Diana stayed with us at the estate for a month, helping us sort through the emotional and physical artifacts of our interrupted family history. She brought with her copies of every letter she had sent over the years, preserved as testimony to her unwavering love despite impossible circumstances. Together, the 3 of us read them chronologically, piecing together the parallel narrative that had existed alongside the story we thought we knew. "I never stopped fighting to reach you," she told us one evening as we sat in what had once been my father's study, now transformed into a bright reading room filled with the art books and family photographs that would have been considered too sentimental for his taste. "But I also had to learn to build a life with the reality I couldn't change. Both things had to be true at once. My love for you and my need to survive his rejection." "How did you do it?" Rebecca asked, her therapist's influence evident in her willingness to voice vulnerability. "How did you start over with nothing and no one?" Diana considered the question thoughtfully. "I focused on what I could build rather than what I had lost. I found purpose in helping children heal through art. I created a new community of people who valued emotional honesty, and I forgave myself for the impossible choice I had to make." She looked between us, her eyes gentle but direct. "That's the hardest part, self-forgiveness. We're so much harsher with ourselves than with anyone else." Rebecca nodded, tears welling. "I've been so angry with you for so long. It was easier than admitting how much I missed you. Easier than questioning Dad's version of events." "Anger made sense as a response to abandonment," Diana acknowledged. "The story you were told explained the pain you felt. I understand why you needed to believe it." "I think I knew something wasn't right," I admitted quietly. "But I was afraid to challenge it directly. Afraid of losing what little connection I had with Dad if I questioned his narrative." Diana reached out, taking each of our hands in hers. "We all did the best we could with what we understood at the time. Now we have a chance to build something new with better understanding. The process hasn't been simple or linear. There have been difficult conversations, unexpected triggers, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves." Diana returned to Santa Fe after her extended visit, though she calls daily and has planned another trip for Christmas. She and Robert are considering a part-time relocation to be closer to us, particularly to Noah, with whom she formed an immediate and profound bond. Rebecca officially moved back to Westmore last month, purchasing a contemporary home near the lake, rather than claiming space at the estate. James commutes between London and Atlanta, while they determine whether his diplomatic career can be transferred. Stateside, the twins have enrolled at Westmore Academy for the fall semester, approaching the transition with typical Sullivan determination masking underlying anxiety. The most surprising development has been Rebecca's evolving approach to the Sullivan enterprises. Rather than attempting to maintain exclusive control as we'd all expected, she has embraced our father's vision of partnership, actively seeking my input on decisions and genuinely valuing my perspective on community impact and historical significance. She's brought her considerable diplomatic skills and global connections to the foundation, while acknowledging my expertise in preservation and community engagement. "We're better together than either of us would be alone," she admitted recently, during a board meeting, causing several longtime Sullivan advisors to nearly drop their fountain pens in shock. Different strengths, different perspectives, but shared values. This afternoon, as Noah and I watch the newly emerged monarch butterfly slowly begin to test its wings, Rebecca joins us in the garden, kicking off her customary heels and kneeling, in the mulch without concern for her linen pants. "Is that one of the chrysalises from last week?" she asks, genuine interest in her voice. "The coloring is extraordinary." Noah nods enthusiastically. "This one took exactly 12 days. I've been checking every morning and evening." "Patience rewarded," Rebecca observes, watching as the butterfly's wings begin to slowly open and close. "I'm still working on that virtue. My therapist says I have an unhealthy relationship with time, always racing ahead instead of experiencing the present moment." I smile, still adjusting to this new version of my sister who can acknowledge her own growth edges without shame. "Well, butterfly gardens are perfect practice for presents. Nothing happens on our preferred schedule here." "Unlike construction projects," Rebecca notes wryly. "Remember how Dad used to offer bonuses for early completion? Always pushing, rushing, as though waiting was somehow a character flaw. He was afraid of stillness," I realize aloud, "of what might surface if he ever truly stopped moving forward." We sit in companionable silence, the three of us, as the butterfly continues its unhurried preparation for flight. Noah has his sketchbook open, capturing the delicate creature with careful pencil strokes. Rebecca observes with appreciative eyes, occasionally asking questions about his technique or creative choices, genuine curiosity replacing her former perfunctory interest in her nephew's life. "Mom's art therapy program is looking for expansion funding," Rebecca mentions casually, though I know her well enough now to recognize the deliberate thought behind the apparent spontaneity. "I've been thinking the foundation could establish a grant specifically for creative healing initiatives, something that honors both her work and Dad's belated recognition of its value." "That would be perfect," I agree, touched by how she's finding ways to integrate both parental influences rather than rejecting everything associated with our father. A bridge between their separate journeys. "A preservation project of a different kind," she adds with a small smile, acknowledging my influence on her thinking. "Honoring what was valuable in our history while creating space for something new to emerge." Noah looks up from his sketch, his expression thoughtful. "Like a butterfly," he observes. "It doesn't reject being a caterpillar. That stage was necessary. But it doesn't stay trapped in that form either." Rebecca and I exchange glances, once again humbled by this young person's natural wisdom. "Exactly like that," Rebecca agrees. "Though some transformations take longer than 12 days, unfortunately." Noah grins. "That's okay, Aunt Rebecca.